On today's World Insight, Iran elects a new president. What does this new administration mean for Iran's foreign relations? And Cui Tiankai announces he is leaving his post as Chinese ambassador to the U.S. to return to China. We take a look at our interviews with this statesman. And a COVID vaccine lifeline amid the pandemic, with China's pledge to deliver doses of the WHO-approved Sinopharm vaccine to COVAX and the world's most vulnerable. But why are vaccines so geopolitically charged?
The effectiveness or possible side effects, we are really talking about years after years of tracking after the injection. So the conclusion about which methodology really works is too early.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Iran's hardline judiciary chief Ibrahim Raisi has won a landslide victory in the presidential election. Election officials say Raisi garnered about 62% of the vote. The 60-year-old conservative cleric will take over from Hassan Rouhani at a critical time. The country hopes to salvage a nuclear deal Washington walked away from in 2018 and revive an economy hit hard by the U.S. sanctions. Chinese President Xi Jinping also sent his congratulations. So how can the incoming administration solve the problems on both the domestic and the international fronts? Let's loop in our panelists. For the latest on Iran and its election result in Beijing, He Wenping, professor at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Tehran, Mohammad Marandi, professor at Tehran University, last but not least in London, Bobby Nadari, journalist and political commentator. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. Professor Marandi, what is your reading of the result of the presidential election in Iran?
Well, I think it's a significant change that Iran will be tilting away from Western countries, especially since the United States and the Europeans have not been showing good last few years. So I expect the new administration to be looking to non-Western countries, the global South, East Asia, Central Asia, neighboring countries, China and Russia, for developing closer relationships.
I see.
I also think that it will put an end to some of the liberal economic policies that have been pursued during the previous years. The new president is left-leaning, so he will be expanding the social welfare net as well as trying to strengthen domestic production. So we will be moving towards the left economically, and I think towards non-Western countries politically.
Mr. Nadari, as a journalist, your take?
It's good news that Iran has once again had elections. He doesn't see the need to normalize ties with the United States or some of its allies. But make no mistake, this president is extremely serious about resolving Iran's nuclear dispute with the U.S. And at the same time, he has made every effort. Yesterday, we saw during his press conference, he made it absolutely clear that he wants to reduce tensions with Iran's neighbors in the Persian Gulf and the greater Middle East, especially when it comes to the conflicts in Iraq, Syria, and of course, Yemen. But as Professor Marandi made it absolutely clear, I don't think that the new government has any inclination or intention to normalize ties with the United States. But when it comes to Europe, yes, Iran is going to take some steps, but again, it is up to the European governments. It wasn't Iran that walked out of the nuclear deal. So if they want to get Iran back to the game, they have no choice but to re-win Iran's trust. And that is going to take some time.
Okay. There are two issues. One is Iranian's own political structure and also ambience, shall we say. And the other, of course, is how Iran will deal with other countries, including its neighbor, and especially the United States, and on the nuclear deal as well. Let's just focus on the domestic first, since this has just been a grand election taking place. Professor Marandi, in Iran's sense, what is the difference between so-called a conservative, like Mr. Raisi, and a liberal, such as President Rouhani? Now, I understand when the words are being used, though they could be the same inside Iran and outside Iran, but they could mean very different things. Professor Marandi, could you help us to understand your understanding of these two words?
In Iran, the so-called conservatives or the principalists, I would say that culturally speaking, they are more conservative than the reformists or the moderates, but economically speaking, they're more leftist. And they tend more towards social justice and the middle class, lower classes, and that they look to them or they focus upon them. Whereas the moderates and the reformists, I think they are both more liberal when it comes to cultural issues, and they're also more liberal with regards to economics. They tend to be more supportive of capitalism and market forces. Of course, this is a very general definition.
Yeah.
There are many different groups within each of these camps.
Once again, I want to emphasize on the nuance that is taking place in any country, and make no mistake, certainly inside Iran. People tend to look at it once again black and white, as if there is an ultimate winner, ultimate loser, but things are not like that, I'm sure. But tell me, how do people inside Iran look at the possibility of transformation of the political system, for example, from a presidential system to parliamentary system, from having a supreme leader who have been playing an instrumental role in leading Iran, to a system in which there might be council leaders. Professor Marandi, there are a lot of guesses from outside Iran. So what do you say about these possibilities?
I don't see any imminent change in the constitution with regards to the presidency and changing the system into a parliamentary system. The system functions and has been functioning for the last 4 decades. We have to remember that Iran has been under a maximum pressure campaign, and that the United States has surrounded the country with military bases. It has murdered Iranian senior officials, and it has been supporting terrorist groups across the region with the Saudis and others, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and inside Iran, the United States has been supporting terrorist organizations. So despite all that, the fact that Iran continues to grow, its influence across the region also continues to grow, I think is pretty impressive. There's no denying that Iran has many problems. But let's say the Central Bank of Germany tomorrow was to be sanctioned by the United States. The economy would collapse immediately. So Iranian sanctions go far beyond the sanctioning of the central bank, yet Iran still stands. So no, I don't believe that the constitution will change. I think the general structure will continue to exist as it does. We have to remember that in France, just a couple of days ago, the turnout for the important regional elections was at 32%, and the youth they only participated at roughly 20%. So no one in Europe or the United States questions the legitimacy of the French state. But Western media, Western elites, because of their antagonism towards Iran, they like to portray Iran in a very different light.
Let's move on to another important topic in which, of course, the international community would play a role. Therefore, I go to Ms. He first from China. about the latest on the Iran nuclear deal. Well, when we talk about deal, there's no deal yet. Since the last president of the United States tried to broke the deal. But now there were the last rounds in Vienna between the Iranians and the Americans with the Europeans as go-betweeners. Ms. He, after watching the Middle East for decades, what do you make of the latest talks? Are they giving any hope of potential agreement?
Yeah, of course. The hope is quite big, actually, because even though the Iranian now had elected a new president, and the new president has been widely regarded as a conservative, even some reporting given him another level, saying the hardener, whatever. This kind of leveling shows some people even doubt about the possible the nuclear deal, the renegotiation maybe will in danger. But I don't think that way, because we have heard the both sides, the United States and the Iranian, the new president, elected the new president, even press conference, the very first press conference. And he promised, also saying, yeah, he wanted to continue to see the good results coming from the negotiation. And the United States, samely, I also heard the Pentagon, the spokesperson from Pentagon also saying the talking about re-entry into this nuclear deal, JCPOA, that's fit with the United States' interest.
Professor Morandi, we see some interesting development, but we do hear both you and your colleague talking about who broke away from the deal first. According to the Iranians, that's the United States. And also the fact that the U.S. has been talking about nothing is agreed upon until everything is agreed upon. And certainly there are many things that have not been agreed upon. This sounds like a tongue twister, but it's not, because everything in it has its own meaning. So Professor Morandi, how big is the hope under the new administration with the president-elect that there might be hope for an agreement?
Well, I'd like to point out that the Western media likes to call him a hardliner, which really doesn't mean anything to me. I think the only reason why they call him a hardliner is because he does not want to appease the United States. But that doesn't mean that he's going to pull out of the agreement. He said so previously, both during the hard-hitting debates during the before the presidential election, and he said so during his press conference. The Iranian position with regards to the nuclear, the same as it was before. The Americans pulled out of the deal, or the Americans did not abide by the deal. Even under Obama, the Americans did not abide by the deal. The head of the central bank at that time in Iran, during the Obama administration, said that the United States never fulfilled its obligations. Then under Trump, they pulled out, and now under Biden, the United States continues to use the maximum pressure sanctions to hurt women and children in order to get new concessions. All the Iranians are saying is that we will not appease the United States if the United States abides by the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, in full. We will abide by the deal in full, because that's what we agreed upon. The Americans can't demand new concessions because we already have an agreement. If the Iranians accept new concessions, to give new concessions to the Americans, that's appeasement, and then the Americans will learn to do this again and again and again in the future. So the Iranians are saying, we negotiated this deal for years, and we will not allow it to be changed. The Chinese support this, Russians support this position, and even the Europeans, they verbally support this position, but we know that the Europeans ultimately will do what the Americans tell them to do.
Professor Morandi, one of the things is how much Iran and the international community could trust the United States with its political system, if I could just put it in a very gentle way. After all, every president, when it comes into power, they would review the apparent Iran nuclear deal possibility and came up with their own roadmap or scrap off the earlier roadmap. So, Professor Morandi, that has been repeated several times. How much do you see the Iranians are confident and enthusiastic about reaching a deal?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. We are not confident, even if there is an agreement, we're not confident that down the road the Americans will abide by the agreement. Current U.S. administration or a future administration. We have a very bad history with the Americans. They supported the Shah during the revolution. They trained his secret police. They supported Saddam Hussein in his invasion. They helped him with chemical weapons. They gave him intelligence to use chemical weapons and political cover in the Security Council. And they've been sanctioning women and children for decades in Iran. So, and even when we cooperated over Afghanistan and dealing with Al-Qaeda, we were called subsequently the axis of evil. So, and of course, with regards to the JCPOA, the Americans never abided by the deal, and ultimately they left the deal. So we have a dark history, but Iran is no longer going to win, is sending.
I see.
He will be moving to the east, to the global south, and to neighboring countries for better relations. If the Europeans and the Americans want better relations, fine. If they don't, we're going to move on.
Mr. Nadari, now President-elect Raisi is still being sanctioned by the United States. The Iranians, according to some media reports, have been suggesting at least that sanction has to be lifted. Otherwise, there's no talk. But it seems that the Americans have been using various ways to suggest that is complicated. Now, how controversial will that single issue be in terms of trying to reach a deal between Iran and the United States?
Well, that's a good question that the establishment is asking right now. I think America has no choice but to lift all sanctions against Iran, including those that are targeting Iran's top officials, like President-elect Raisi, and of course our leader and the establishment. So many different traditional institutions, organizations are still under U.S. sanctions, and these sanctions need to be lifted. Reports suggest that America is not willing to give a written statement or sign a new deal. It just wants to give its words. Promise that I'm going to lift it, and every year I will review these sanctions to make sure that they are still in place if Iran doesn't commit itself to the nuclear deal. I think there is a simple solution for that. Iran should also do the same. Iran shouldn't sign any deal with America, any nuclear agreement, any written statement, and just like the US repeat the same pattern, like I am going to renew my commitment every year, or that's exactly what I'm going to do if America does the same thing, or reciprocate, as Professor Morandi made it clear. So there is a way out of this, quagmire, there is a way to resolve this stumbling block. I think this is not the American century anymore. America needs to come to its senses and realize that this is a multilateral world. That's why it is removing its defense systems and forces from the Middle East, because there is basically nowhere else for America to destroy in the Middle East. So it is trying to go somewhere else to do the same thing, repeat and repeat and repeat. This kind of loop, imperial loop that we have seen for so many decades. So I think that America this time has learned its lessons. Definitely it is going to stick to the nuclear deal for some time, because it has so many other things in its mind to do, is like economic recovery, like trying to control, China, Russia, and so many other countries. Iran is the last thing in its mind right now.
Ms. He, therefore I want to go to you about it. I mean, Iran is in the middle of a dramatic changes in the region. And of course, the world is also experiencing very, very different geopolitical atmosphere right now, if not realities. So, Ms. He, from your perspective, how much opportunity does Iran have this time when the Americans, rhetorically at least, suggested that they want a deal?
Yeah, I think after Joe Biden entered into the White House and also give intention to re-enter into this nuclear deal, JCPOA, I think that this has offered some these opportunities for Iran back with the international world, especially also to improve relations with the neighboring countries, including Saudi. So we have seen Biden administration has made some adjustment about those Middle East policy. For example, like Saudis now they don't supported Saudi to continue their war in Yemen, and even Houthi forces now has been out of those terrorist lists anymore. So those changes has bring the the new diplomatic room for Iranian side. There are several rounds of those negotiations going on between Iranian government and with Saudi government. So maybe in the future we will see those two countries that will re-establish the diplomatic ties, because there's no any single reasons for Biden administration to keep on those sanctions imposed by Trump administration.
Well, but we have seen over the past half year, since the Biden administration coming into power, that actually it's been keeping many of the sanctions in place that the Trump administration put on the others, whether they are reasonable or not from different perspectives. So I'm not sure whether that is really how Washington works these days, but it's an interesting point. I want to go to you, Professor Morandi, about the nuclear deal. There are technical issues too. For example, one of the nuclear reactors inside Iran recently, according to some media reports, at least the Western media reports, have been in the process or in the danger of shutting down because of lack of components and parts that could only be available after the sanctions are being lifted against Iran. So, Professor Morandi, how strong or how is the status of Iran's nuclear capability right now also gives Iran and the United States reasons as to how to continue with the negotiations if it continues?
Western media reports, as you know quite well, are very exaggerated when it comes to Iran. And Iran's nuclear power plant is just going through normal repairs. That will last a few days, and that's the end of the story. But they like to make it a big issue like everything else in Iran. You will never hear anything positive about Iran in the Western media. The United States is targeting Iranian women and children through sanctions. They're killing Iranians through sanctions. When the coronavirus broke out, the Americans prevented Iran from importing masks. They prevented Iran from importing ventilators, and they prevented Iran from importing test kits. And things were developed, by blocking Iran's capability to use the banking system, they blocked Iran's efforts to import vaccines. And when the Iranians decided to develop their own vaccine because of the sanctions, the Americans sanctioned all of the companies that were involved in this. So this is how the Americans actually weaponized a virus. And I must add that the Chinese government, when the virus first broke out in Iran, what they did instead was they sent aid to Iran. They sent masks and ventilators. And by the way, I should say that before Iran was hit, Iran also sent aid to China as well.
True.
So when you see countries like Iran and China trying to help each other, and then you see the Americans trying to harm ordinary Iranians, I think that leaves the big question: who is violating human rights? Is it Iran or the United States?
Lastly, I want to ask the Chinese guest, Madam He, to respond about China-Iran relation. According to the latest news, Chinese President Xi Jinping have already sent congratulation messages to the newly elected president-elect in Iran, and also suggest that China and Iran are in a comprehensive strategic partnership. And this year marks the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and Iran. And he said, the Chinese president said, I emphasize much on the development of the bilateral relations, and I'm willing to be with the president-elect, work together, strengthen bilateral strategic communication, strengthen bilateral political trust, and also expand and deepen the cooperation, mutual beneficial cooperation between the two sides in various fields to benefit the two countries and the two peoples. These are some of the key messages coming from the Chinese president in his congratulatory message to the new president-elect inside Iran. Madam He, briefly, how do you read these messages, and where is China and Iran out of this very complicated realities today?
Yeah, I think we have heard both Chinese leader and Iran, this new elected president, both of them have sent very strong those wishes to strengthen our bilateral ties. I also remember that elected President Raisi mentioned that China-Iran will continue to expand our cooperation scope and to deepen our cooperation those all kinds of ways. And he particularly mentioned recently we have signed like 25 years comprehensive deal. Yeah, that deal already in the agenda of Iranian government, which means they now take it very seriously to implement this 25 years cooperation deal. So actually, I think there's no doubt China can offer a lot of help for Iranian, even the new government, to focus on the economic construction, because this is the priority coming to the new elected president, his administration. Yeah, he picked up saying the economic recovery and also how to improve people's livelihood. That will going to be the priority for the new government. So in that way, China-Iranian cooperation can further develop.
I see. Well, I want to thank the three of you helping us to understand the latest in Iran, not just going to the references in the Western media, but rather bringing more nuances about what's really happening inside the country. He Wenping, Mohammad Marandi, and Bobby Nadari, thank you so much. And best wishes to the people in Iran in their fight against the COVID-19. Thank you so much. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Ambassador Cui Tiankai, China's longest-serving ambassador to the United States, confirmed this week that he will be leaving Washington. After 8 years of service, Ambassador Cui said in his latest statement that China-U.S. relationship is at a key crossroad that will have to choose between dialogues and conflicts. During the years, I had several exclusive interviews with the Chinese ambassador, a seasoned diplomat on the front line. Let's take a look back at some of them. Chinese ambassador to the United States, Mr. Cui Tiankai. Let's listen to Mr. Cui Tiankai. I talked to Chinese ambassador Cui Tiankai, our exclusive with Cui Tiankai. Ambassador Cui, welcome to CGTN.
Well, you see, China and the United States are two very different countries. But at the same time, I think the two countries have been able to manage these differences in a very constructive way. We always believe that the right approach is to base ourselves on better mutual respect and expand our cooperation, manage possible differences in a constructive way. If we talk about bridge, our two peoples, our two countries, over the last 4 decades or so, have built a very strong bridge. It's already there. The bilateral relations between China and the United States should have the same goal. We should aim at mutual benefit and strengthen our cooperation. We should have mutual respect whenever we manage our differences, and really build a relationship based on the long-term best interests of our two people.
My earlier interview with Chinese ambassador to the United States, Cui Tiankai, who has announced that he's leaving Washington. You're watching World Insight. Coming up in the program, a COVID vaccine lifeline amid the pandemic, with China's pledge to deliver doses of the WHO-approved Sinopharm vaccine to COVAX and to the world's most vulnerable. But why are vaccines so geopolitically charged? An international studies professor with answers up next. Welcome back. This is World Insight, and I'm Tian Wei. The global fight against the pandemic has made little progress recently, with scarce delivery of COVID vaccines to most vulnerable countries, as rich countries have stockpiled doses. Earlier, the World Health Organization granted emergency approval of China's Sinopharm vaccine, the first from a non-Western country to gain the WHO's approval. China has pledged to provide an initial batch of 10 million vaccines to COVAX. And despite huge domestic demand, it has provided more than 350 million doses of its COVID-19 vaccines overseas. So, could the Chinese vaccines help to turn the tide against the pandemic? Could geopolitics get in the way of matters of life and death? Earlier, I spoke to Jia Daozhong, a professor at the School of International Studies from Peking University. Let's hear his thoughts. I'm joined by Professor Jia Daozhong from the School of International Studies at Peking University. He's been devoting a lot of his energy recently on vaccine-related issues research. Professor Jia, good to see you again.
Good seeing you, and good evening.
Good evening to you. Now, what do you make of, finally, some of China's vaccines made onto the emergency use list of WHO's vaccine for COVID-19?
It's a development that's worth celebrating for possibly three main reasons. One is that the WHO has really exercised its authority in approving a quality vaccine, as you have certainly observed. Along the way, there were numerous questioning about the safety, efficacy of the Chinese-made vaccines, and there were accusations of China using vaccines for diplomatic purpose. So the WHO was under a lot of stress, but it exercised its proper judgment. And secondly, for the Chinese product itself, it can take pride in the fact that this is a vaccine that's developed in a developing country that has received emergency use authorization by the WHO. And it's a milestone achievement. Now, most importantly, that's a third one, that is the Chinese vaccine, because partly because of what's accused of political diplomacy. China has been working rather hard in making its vaccine products available both domestically and internationally. If you look at the number of doses injected, about half were in China, about half abroad. Yes. So the rest of the world, especially in the poor countries, desperately needs vaccines, so we have this available and with good authorization.
Now, this is quite unprecedented, but at the same time, before this, China's vaccines have already won, bilateral approval in 40 countries and regions already. What does that mean to WHO in a way as reference?
Well, the WHO actually is more than just a bureaucracy. It formulates it appoints a panel that's called, the acronym is SAGE, which is Strategic Advisory Group of Experts in Immunology. So in other words, these are individuals who normally work in hospitals, in university research labs, in teaching jobs. These are really professionals around the world who have their personal career and reputation on the line. So they're making their independent judgments. They make a recommendation for the WHO headquarters to adopt.
Yes.
So we're really talking about expertise. But in terms of, I don't think the SAGE group counts, the number of government that approve any vaccine, or it worries about vaccine approvals at all. Basically, these are professionals,
right.
the research people who have to be responsible to science.
Professor Jia, the other thing is about the types of vaccines that China produces different if you look at the short list of emergency use by WHO, very different in types compared to the other vaccines. So how do you see the fact that it seems that all kinds of vaccines now are making themselves onto the list?
There are at least 14 proven pathways to develop a vaccine from scratch. Now, the methodology that's being used by the 2 Chinese vaccines in the UL list is proven. It has been in the market for some 30 to 40 years. It's not the vaccine that use what's called more advanced or latest development in some of the Western countries. But I don't really know if how to assess this. Whatever technology, whatever technological pathway you take, at the end of the day, it has to be proven safe and effective. Right. And to assess the effectiveness or possible side effects, we are really talking about years after years of tracking after the injection. So the conclusion about which methodology really works is too early.
Let me ask you, the world is not in a vacuum. There are so many different factors that are impacting on the future of vaccines, including on the COVAX platform. Now, how much geopolitics play its role? At this moment, how much can we afford geopolitics to play its role? In terms of life and death, how are we going to make our choice, politics or life?
At this point of time, highly political, partly because of the uncertainties of new variants, and then the challenge between opening your borders and closing the borders, or choosing that narrow window. Everybody wants to return to normal as fast as possible. What's not being justifiable is that some of the developed countries are literally hoarding vaccines, and the vaccines have a lifespan. Some of the new products actually will have to be discarded or destroyed after a couple of months of storage. And then you have residents in many of the developed countries that refuse to take the vaccines. So an obvious solution in terms of humanity is to ship these availables through COVAX or bilaterally, but that's not being done. Or in the case of some situations, some governments say, well, I can ship to you certain million doses, but this is really a loan to you. At some point of time, you have to return it to me.
Yeah.
And this is a very typical my country first approach. But you asked a really good question. But on the other hand, I would think the dire situation is that the developing countries have to just find ways to get into partnerships and speed up probably manufacturing of vaccines outside certain prime locations. But of course, that needs to be done on the basis of safety first and the technical expertise first.
Now, of course, India used to play a big role in terms of international production of vaccines. Now, the country itself faced certain challenge and therefore decided not to export vaccines anymore that they produced. So, Professor Jia, how big a vacuum or a hole we are likely to see? Do you see others will be able to play a proactive role in terms of filling that holes?
It's a big yes and no. Now, a word about the Indian situation first. India is very strong in manufacturing the vaccines, as just pointed out. But it has to be living at the mercy of, opening the supply chain, keeping the supply chains open in terms of the raw materials, in terms of the ingredients, and especially the key ingredients that developed in labs in Europe and North America. Otherwise, the factories in India are going to be running on empty. And secondly, India has its own version of vaccines, and that production can be ramped up. And then to address the dire situation in that country, I would think to have some confidence in the vaccines that produced later on in India, or is that we really help India with the ingredients so that they can move forward and get the factories running in full capacity again and vaccinate Indians. But then for other countries, you pay attention, here in China, over there in South Korea, in Mexico and Vietnam, Brazil and whatnot, Malaysia and Singapore. We have a lot of facilities that can manufacture as well. Here, the issue is intellectual property rights. The issue is technology transfer. And then you also have the issue of, this goes back to those companies that have been recommended by the WHO to supply the world. They should really rethink the good old strategy of maximizing the profits. If they can come down with that demand for maximizing shareholder profits, they can reduce the premium they charge on the manufacturers. They can simplify the procedures. Then we can expand production fairly fast.
Yeah. Professor Zhao Daoxiong from Peking University, who has been devoting his energy recently on the research of geopolitics related to vaccines. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.